All right, Old Testament survey, lesson 17, Leviticus of the Levites. That's our lesson for today. Today we are going to do an overview of the entire book of Leviticus, and our objective will be to complete that in the next hour and 10 minutes. So approximately 7 minutes to survey the book of Leviticus. And it's called Of the Levites, which is what Leviticus means in English, because it primarily deals with the tribe of Levi, the family of Aaron, the priests of God, and their ministry and function as the intercessors between God and man, those who speak to God on man's behalf. Uh, and this is really the book that more than any other focuses on the Levites and the tabernacle and later the temple ministries. So the overview, Moses, the man of God, is the author. The occasion is in the wilderness, somewhere around 1451 BC. If the Israelites left Egypt around 1446 BC, Leviticus seems to have been written not long after the events in it are portrayed, and some of them appear from the text to have been written concurrently with with when they were experiencing them. Um, the the role of the tabernacle and priesthood in keeping the fire of Jehovah burning in Israel is the theme. Again, the theme is the role of the tabernacle and priesthood in keeping the fire of Jehovah burning in Israel. Introduction. Leviticus simply means of the Levites and is the book that prescribes the mission, role, function, and activities of the children of Levi as the tribe whose possession in the land is Jehovah himself. All of the other tribes of Israel received a land portion as their possession, as their portion from the Lord. The Levites, aside from cities in every tribal possession where they would do their ministry, the Levites were told, your possession is Jehovah himself. The key to understanding the book is to see it as an art gallery filled with portraits painted in object lessons, each depicting individual aspects of the complete work of the Christ as the priest, propitiation, and peace from God. The book is in 5 natural divisions. Chapters 1 through 7 are the offerings of the people to their God, and uh, chapters 8 through 10, the priests and the priestly office. Chapters 11 through 15, practicing the holiness of God's separated living. Chapters 16 through 22, the holy people of Jehovah. And the fifth and final part, practicing the presence of Jehovah in the land, chapters 23 through 27. So beginning then with part 1, the offerings of the people to their God, this section is divided into 3 parts. The first are the overview of the sweet savor offerings. The second are the non-sweet savor offerings. And the third are the laws of the offerings for each of the above. So let's begin in chapter 1 with the burnt offering. There were 3 types of burnt offerings given to the Israelites that would be performed on the brazen altar, the altar made of bronze or brass in the temple courtyard. It was said to be a whole burnt offering, meaning that they were to burn it completely. in some cases. In other cases, it would be burnt, but then the priests would be able to eat what was cooked on the altar. Um, there were three types of offerings that could be a burnt offering. One was a bullock or something from the cattle. The second was a sheep or a goat, something from the flock or herd. And the last was the fowls, or something from the birds of the sky, such as a turtle dove or a pigeon. Each of these appears to be representative of seeing Christ in his sacrificial role in a different way. The bullock represents Christ as the serving Christ, dying as the servant of man and the servant of God. Excuse me. The uh, the bullock or the uh, the oxen or any other animal that an Israelite might have really served one of two purposes. Either they were for food or they were beasts of burden. They might use them in the field. They might use them to move things in carts. They might use them for transportation. They might use them as a food source. But the bulls essentially served, all the cattle served the people of Israel. And so they picture Jesus in the sacrifice of a bullock as the serving Christ. The sheep or the goat typifies Jesus as the sacrificial Christ, the substitute sacrifice. And that's why so many of the feast days involve the offering of sheep or goats. The fowls or the birds represent Christ as the innocent Christ. And I think there's also something to the idea that birds are taken from the heaven to become a sacrifice in the tabernacle, much the same way that Jesus came from heaven and became the sacrifice at Calvary. So in the burnt offerings in chapter 1, you see three different kinds of burnt offering that each represent some aspect of Christ as the sacrifice. In chapter 2, we see the meat offering. And the interesting thing about the meat offering is that by our reckoning, it doesn't have any meat in it, right? Because we think of meat as flesh, but that's not how they meant it in in England long ago, and that's not how they meant it in Israel in the ancient past. This is actually a baked bread style of offering. What's interesting about it is that it's flour mixed with frankincense. Flour then represents humanity coming out of the earth, and frankincense is used in the temple in the uh, in the altar of incense to represent the presence of God. So flour and frankincense represents God in man in the person of Jesus. So it's a sacrifice that recognizes that Jesus is God manifest in the flesh. The peace offering represents Jesus satisfying God's justice to make peace between God and man. Any questions about that part so far? No comments? Oh, yes, Junior. Yes. Yep. Okay. It could. I think the most obvious interpretation is that The frankincense in the flower is representative of deity in man. So Jesus having being both God and man. So um, okay, chapters 4 and 5 deal with the non-sweet savor offerings. So the distinction here is that the burnt offerings above were offerings that were supposed to create a sweet smelling savor or scent in the nostrils of God. So you would give these offerings and they would smell good in heaven. Okay. The non-sweet savor offerings, chapters 4 and 5, are the sin offering and the trespass offering. In chapter 4, we see a picture of Jesus who became sin for us. Or as it says, he became sin who knew no sin. He didn't have any sin of his own, but he became sin for us so that he could be. Hold on one second. My Bluetooth is coming loose. Okay. Um, he became sin for us. And I don't know that we can really emphasize enough just how incredible and remarkable it is to think that God, manifest in the flesh as the Son of Man, innocent of all sin, righteous and holy from all eternity, became sin for us. And the repugnance that Jesus must have had for that moment as he accepts upon him all the sins of all the sinners for all of time. He became sin for us. And then there's the trespass offering, which is related but not exactly the same. The trespass offering speaks to the consequences of the sin being expiated. So while the sin offering deals with the sin itself, and simply the immorality and wrongness of sin, the trespass offering specifically deals with the consequences of sin and the expiation of those consequences. So you see in the non-sweet savor offerings then um, the twofold way that Jesus deals with our sin. He pays for the sin itself, and he also addresses the consequences. I think that is something that we would do well not to overlook. So here we have 5 different types of offerings in Leviticus chapters 1 through 5, and each of them describes something different about Jesus coming and dying for us. So, does anyone know what the biblical number of grace is? 5. 5 types of offerings. 5 is the number of grace. All right. Um, in chapter 6, in the opening verses of chapter 6, we actually come to one of our theme verses in this book. If you look at verse 13 of Leviticus 6, it speaks of the fire on the altar, and it says, "The fire shall ever be burning upon the altar, it shall never go out." And in a few minutes, when we get to chapter 10, we'll see why that is so important. But if you go back to verse 8, it says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Command Aaron and his sons, saying, This is the law of the burnt offering. It is the burnt offering because of the burning upon the altar all night unto the morning. and the fire on the altar shall be burning in it. And the priest shall put on his linen garment, and his linen breeches shall he put upon his flesh, and take up the ashes which the fire hath consumed with the burnt offering on the altar, and he shall put them beside the altar. And he shall put off his garments and put on other garments, and carry forth the ashes without the camp unto a clean place. And the fire upon the altar shall be burning in it, it shall not be put out. And the priest shall burn wood on it every morning, and lay the burnt offering in order upon it, and shall burn thereon the fat of the peace offerings. The fire shall ever be burning upon the altar, it shall never go out. It's a charge and a promise all in one. The Israelites are never supposed to let the fire go out. But as we get into chapters 6 and 7, we learn that there are laws for the offerings. And so in Leviticus chapter, someone just come off mute. Okay. Um, I can't hear you, Junior. Oh, that's fine. All right, so the laws of the offering, beginning in chapter 6, verse 1, we see the trespass offering. So essentially, if a person commits a trespass against the Lord, lies to his neighbor in that which was delivered him to keep, or in fellowship, or in a thing taken away by violence, or hath deceived his neighbor, or have found that which was lost, and lieth concerning it, etc. In other words, if a person trespasses against the Lord by sinning against his neighbor, this is the offering that is brought. It's also important to note that it says in verse 6 that the offering for his trespass must be a ram without blemish out of the flock. And you must bring your estimation. That is, what is it that you are giving as restitution for the person whom you have harmed? And the priest shall make an atonement for him before the Lord, and it shall be forgiven him for anything of all that he hath done in trespassing therein. So even though you were required to bring the sacrifice to God, you were also required to bring the restitution with which you would make whole the person that you harmed. Do you think that's sometimes missing from our theology today? You know, well, I asked God to forgive me, so that should be the end of it. But the Bible, even in the New Testament, is pretty clear about the importance of making amends, and amends includes making restitution where possible, right? So I think it's important that we are aware that that is still part of God's principles today. Secondly, in chapter 6, verses 8 through 13, as we read a moment ago, the burnt offering laws are clearly explored. And as we saw, the burnt offering is supposed to burn all night upon the altar. And then the part that burns off with the ashes is supposed to be carried outside the camp to a clean place, which kind of reminds me of Jesus being taken without the city and being buried in a garden on a hilltop. And then wood is to be brought in so that the fire never goes out. Okay? Hang on to that, never goes out, because we're going to come back to it. The laws of the offering continue with the meat offering. The meat offering that doesn't have any meat. The flour and frankincense that represents God in man. Verses 14 through 23 give us the law of the meat offering. It is supposed to have flour, it is supposed to have oil, and it is supposed to have frankincense, which are upon the meat offering, and they burn it on the altar for a sweet savor, even the memorial of it unto the Lord. Whatever's left, Aaron and his sons get to eat. So the priests get to eat of the remaining bread that is baked from the offering made by fire. Okay, um, it's bacon. It's not allowed to be baked with leaven, and the priests are not allowed to let um, anyone else besides Aaron and his sons eat of it. Okay, but all the men of the children of Aaron shall eat of it. And then he goes on in verses 19 through 23 to talk about the meat offering specifically for Aaron and his sons. And it says, when he is anointed, then they will offer a meat offering that is the tenth part of an ephah of fine flour, and it will be a meat offering perpetual, half of it in the morning and half thereof at night. And they make this one in a pan with oil, and then they bring it in, and the baked pieces of the meat offering they offer for a sweet savor unto the Lord. And it even goes on specifically to talk about the next high priest. Verse 22, it says, and the priest of his sons that is anointed in his stead shall offer it. So when Aaron is gone, one of his sons is to be anointed in his place. The high priest of Israel is always supposed to be of the sons of Aaron. And then lastly, the sin offering is fully explored with its laws in verses 24 through 30. And in the sin offering, remember, this is the offering in which Christ becomes sin for us. We are told that the priest that offers the sin offering shall eat it in the holy place that shall be eaten. Now, this is not the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, but in the sanctuary, um, between the table of showbread and the menorah, the golden candlestick, and with the with the um, with the altar of incense in front of you, you are to eat this offering because it represents the priest bringing the sin offering in to the presence of God. Okay, um, whatever touches the flesh is made holy because it touched the sin offering. Okay. Um, the earthen vessel where it was sodden had to be broken. So you couldn't reuse the pot that you made it in. They had to be scoured if it was a brass pot, but it had to be broken if it was a clay pot. Okay. All the males among the priests eat of it because it's most holy. Also, no sin offering whereof any of the blood is brought into the tabernacle of the congregation to reconcile withal in the holy place shall be eaten. It shall be burnt in the fire. If the blood is brought into the tabernacle for the cleansing of the tabernacle, the ceremonial cleansing, you could not eat that sin offering. That had to be completely burned and given to God. And then chapter 7, verses 1 through 10, deal further with the trespass offering, and it speaks of where they will kill the burnt offering and where they shall kill the trespass offering and what they are to do with the parts of the animal. Okay. Um, and then lastly, the peace offering is described. once again. And the law of the peace offering is that he offers it for a thanksgiving, then he shall offer with the sacrifice of thanksgiving unleavened cakes. So if your peace offering is made simply as a giving of thanks offering, then you bring with it cakes mingled with oil and unleavened wafers. Okay. If he's offering the the sacrifice as a whole oblation for an heave offering unto the Lord, that means it's supposed to be given to God, and the priest that sprinkles the blood of the peace offering shall take that and eat it. It's important for us to realize how specific God was about these things. I think it's easy for us to overlook God's specificity, right? God was so specific because these are holy things, and each one of these things was teaching the Israelites and us something about Jesus. And so, if they don't do it right, they might teach the wrong lessons. In chapters 8, 9, and 10, the second part of the book, the priests and the priestly office are discussed. In chapter 8, we see the consecration of the sons of Aaron. And their consecration is really interesting. And in verses 1 through 5, Moses is told to bring the sons of Aaron and the garments and the anointing oil and a bullock for the sin offering and 2 rams and a basket of unleavened bread, and gather all of them to the congregation unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. So they all come together, and Moses did what he was told, and Moses said in the congregation, "This is what the Lord says we're going to do." Moses brought Aaron and his sons and washed them with water. That's interesting, isn't it? He washed them. And he put upon him, Aaron, the coat and girded him with the girdle, and clothed him with the robe, and put the ephod upon him, and he girded him with curious girdle of the ephod, and bound it unto him therewith. And he put the breastplate upon him. Also he put the breastplate, the Urim and the Thummim. Okay. And he put the mitre upon his head, also upon the mitre, even upon his forefront, did he put the golden plate, the holy crown, as the Lord commanded Moses. So first he washes them, and then he dresses Aaron in the high priestly apparel in front of them all. Okay? So everyone is watching as they begin this consecration. Moses takes the anointing oil and he anoints the tabernacle and all that is therein, and then he sprinkles the altar 7 times, and he anoints the altar and all of the vessels of the altar. He also anoints the laver and the foot of the laver to sanctify them. He poured of the anointing oil upon Aaron's head and anointed him in order to sanctify him. And Moses brought Aaron's sons and put coats upon them and girded them with girdles and put bonnets upon them, as the Lord commanded Moses. Then he brought a bullock for a sin offering, and this was a sin offering specifically for the family of Aaron. So Aaron and his sons laid their hands upon the head of the bullock for the sin offering, and then Moses slew it, took the blood, and put it upon the horns of the altar. And he then began to sanctify and make reconciliation for the sons of Aaron upon it. Before they could intercede for the people, first Moses had to intercede for them. They had to be reconciled to God before they could reconcile the people to God. And he goes on and he talks about all the different steps that he took in the consecration of the people. Verse 23 specifically talks about how he had killed a ram and he took the blood of it and put it upon the tip of Aaron's right ear and upon the thumb of his right hand and upon the great toe of his right foot. And he brought Aaron's sons, and Moses put of the blood upon the tip of their right ear and upon the thumbs of their right hands and upon the great toes of their right feet. And Moses sprinkled the blood upon the altar round about. Now, this seems kind of odd, really. The right ear, the right thumb, the right toe. Um, I've heard a lot of different explanations as to what the specific purpose of this was with these, three specific body parts. Does anyone have any theories you would like to propose or that you've heard you'd like to share? One of the most interesting ones that I heard was that it has to do with balance because the big toe and the thumb and the ear are part of the body's natural balancing system. I will concur that the big toe is part of your balance and that the ear is certainly part of your balance. Our natural body rhythm and balance are controlled in the inner ear, but I'm not sure that's true about a thumb. I've never been able to have anyone explain to me how a thumb is part of your natural balance. So um, I'm not necessarily discounting that theory. I'm just saying that part of it seems a little weak to me. Lauren? Mm-hmm. No, I think you're definitely getting right. The position of the priest between God and man, the one who speaks for God, or excuse me, who speaks to God for the people, speaks for the people to God, who brings their sacrifices to God, who makes intercession with God for the people. Um, I think that's what we're talking about here. The big toe, because they walk on sacred ground. They walk in the courtyard and in the sanctuary of the holy place. And the high priest, once a year, goes in to the holiest place. And so I think that it's sanctifying their big toe in the sense that they are being sanctified because of where they walk. Um, the thumb, because they minister about the holy things of God. They are the ones who make the sacrifices. They are the ones who even wash and keep the vessels. They are the ones who are handling the showbread. They are the ones who prepare and burn the incense on the altar of incense. They are the ones who take the beaten oil and use it to fill the light in the menorah. So I think for all of those reasons, that's why the thumb, because of the things they handle, is sanctified. The ear. because they are the ones who hear the confessions of the people and who bring their confessions to God for reconciliation. Not in the Roman Catholic sense of auricular confession, but in the sense that the people come to them when they have sinned or trespassed against a brother and say, I'm here to make restitution and to offer this sacrifice for cleansing with God. Um, for that reason, their ear is also anointed. Okay. Um, in a sense, they represent the feet, the hands, and the ears of God among the people. So I think those are all good. I think Lauren is definitely definitely hitting those. Chapter 9, we begin to see the ministry of the sons of Aaron. Um, the ministry of the sons of Aaron, and they begin to perform their sacred, sacerdotal duties in the house of God. And as they are doing this, they are preparing the first offerings that will go on the brazen altar. And as they do this, they take a bullock, they take a ram, they have taken a kid of the goats, and they have a young calf and a ram, and they have all of these burnt offerings that they are preparing for the first sacrifice in the house of God. And as they get everything ready, and Aaron lifts up his hand toward the people and blesses them in verse 22, and came down from the offering of the sin offering and the burnt offering and the peace offerings. How does the fire on the altar get lit? And Moses, verse 23, and Aaron went into the tabernacle of the congregation and came out and blessed the people, and the glory of the Lord appeared unto all the people, and there came a fire out from before the altar and consumed upon the altar the burnt offering and the fat, which when all the people saw, they shouted and fell on their faces. Now, let's see if we can tie together Leviticus 9:24 with what we read earlier in Leviticus 6:13, one of the theme verses for Leviticus, and tell me if you can see why the fire was never allowed to go out on the altar in the courtyard. Why would the Why would the fire never be allowed to go out? Leviticus chapter 6, verse 13. The fire shall ever be burning upon the altar, it shall never go out. And then you read 9:24, and it tells you how the fire was started. So why is the altar not allowed to go out? Right, which was, yeah, the fire came from God, right? It's Jehovah's fire. It's the fire of the Lord, as it is called in chapter 10, as we'll see in a moment. The fire of the Lord lit the fire in the altar. That's why they were supposed to take coals from off the altar of burnt offering, the brazen altar, into the sanctuary to light the incense on the altar of incense, because the fire of Jehovah lit the fire in the brazen altar. Okay? So Jehovah's fire was never to be allowed to go out. It kind of reminds me of the day of Pentecost. The Holy Spirit brought the fire into the house of God, and it's our responsibility to keep the fire burning and to keep the fire growing. And if the fire goes out in any New Testament church, in any house of God, It's not because God's fire wasn't good enough. It's because we did not do an adequate job as the keepers of the flame. But there will be churches on earth. Yeah. Amen. Um, but if the light goes out in my church, it's not because God's fire wasn't good enough. It's because we didn't keep the flame. Um, and that brings us to this interesting moment in chapter 10. Um, and actually, I want to read this to you. Leviticus 10, verse 1. And Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took either of them his censer and put fire therein and put incense thereon and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he commanded them not. And there went out fire from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. So when they came with their strange fire, God's fire jumped off the altar and killed them. Now, if you were to attempt to make an analogy to ministry in the house of God today, if the fire of Jehovah is represented in spirit and in truth, as Jesus said that's what true worship is, what would be an example or some examples of strange fire from without that we might try to bring in? Yeah, the opposite of truth is error, right? So definitely false doctrine. Yeah. What if it's good to resist? Um, the so if error is the opposite of if if error is the opposite of truth, what would be the opposite of worshiping in spirit? Yeah, worshiping in flesh, right? Um, Sometimes there's nothing wrong with the song that we're singing, but there's something wrong with the singer, right? I mean, I've heard it suggested that it's the newfangled music that is the problem. Well, all the music we have was newfangled when it first came in, right? Um, it's not the song; it's the singer. If we're doing the ministry of God in the flesh, if we're worshiping in the flesh, that's not true worship, right? If the sermon is about aggrandizing the preacher instead of glorifying Christ and edifying the saints, that's not worship in spirit. Even if every word of the sermon is true, if it's preached in the flesh instead of in the spirit, that probably would have been a sermon better off not preached. Um, so beware of the strange fire offering before the Lord. From there, we go to chapters 11 through 15, the third part of the book. And I call this Practicing the Holiness of God hyphen separated living. And he goes into detail about dietary restrictions in chapter 11, things that you can eat, things that you can't eat, clean versus unclean. And isn't it interesting that the idea of clean versus unclean things does not begin here? God told Noah to bring 7 of every clean beast and 2 of every unclean beast into the ark. Doesn't that seem to imply, or from that, can't we infer that Noah knew the difference between clean and unclean? That clean and unclean were not a new concept. Okay. Um, the Gentiles were not forbidden to eat of the unclean, but apparently, going back all the way to Noah, they at least knew what they were. So, in the practicing of the holiness for separated living, he even tells them to start out by, go ahead, Lauren. Well, and when God told him to make the sacrifices, you notice he only sacrificed the clean ones, which is probably a good thing because he had extra, right? Because he brought in 7. We would not, except that Genesis told us he sacrificed the clean ones. So I think the point is the concept of clean and unclean wasn't created just so the Israelites could be healthier. The concept of clean and unclean was something more than that. And mhm. in in Leviticus 14, in addition to dietary laws, I'm sorry, in Leviticus 13, in addition to dietary laws, there are also laws about leprosy, and there are laws about other diseases that could be contagious. And so the contagious are to be separated, and the priests also seem to have a role as healers. They were the doctors of the ancient world until there were doctors. Um, chapter 14 is a really odd thing. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, This shall be the law of the leper in the day of his cleansing. He shall be brought unto the priest, and the priest shall go forth out of the camp, and the priest shall look and be and behold, if the plague of leprosy be healed in the leper, then shall the priest command to take for him that is to be cleansed 2 birds alive and clean, and cedar wood, and scarlet, and hyssop, and the priest shall command that one of the birds be killed in an earthen vessel over running water. As for the living bird, he shall take it, and the cedar wood, and the scarlet, and the hyssop, and shall dip them and the living bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over the running water. And he shall sprinkle upon him that is to be cleansed from the leprosy 7 times, and shall pronounce him clean, and shall let the living bird loose into the open field. Now, here's an interesting thing. Leprosy is an uncurable disease. Leprosy is incurable. You have it until it kills you or something else does first, right? That's how leprosy works. Incurable disease. Yet, for some reason, this sacrifice of the cleansed leper is in the law of Moses. It wasn't for Naaman because Naaman was a Syrian. He didn't go to the temple in Jerusalem and say, "Do me up for the sacrifice for the cleansed leper." He got in his chariot and he went home, right? But when Jesus healed the lepers, he specifically told them, "Go to the priest and ask for the sacrifice for the cleansed leper." Do you wonder if the priests scratched their heads and looked at each other and said, "Can somebody look that one up? We've never done it before." What in the world happened? You said you had leprosy. You don't have any leprosy. Are you messing with us? No, I had leprosy this morning. I met a man named Jesus and he fixed me. Do that sacrifice that the law says to do. Right. And they couldn't find the leprosy because Jesus had cured him. Um, in the 15th chapter, he speaks about the importance of cleanliness and the cleanliness, the uncleanness that can come because of things coming out of your body, um, including menstruation or blood or semen or urine, any of these things that can bring uncleanness. It's as though God, long before a microscope was invented, already knew about germs, right? It's as if God somehow already knew about germs before the microscope was invented. And he prescribed to them what would happen if a person was made clean and needed a sacrifice. Um, this was all part of the Israelites practicing the holiness of God and separated living. These were specific things that, though they had health benefits and certainly they were good for public order because it helped to reduce the risk of a plague wiping out the population, the main purpose of these was spiritual. This was the people of God acting in a way that showed they were different from the peoples around them, the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, etc., because their God was different, because they served the true and living God. And so they were practicing the holiness of God in separated living. And then the fourth part of the book deals with the holy people of Jehovah. In in chapters 16 through 22, we see the following. The Day of Atonement is described in chapter 16 as the day the Israelites will mourn for sin. And this would be the day that the scapegoat would be set free while the other goat would be killed. The brazen altar is the only sacrificial altar in all the land. So, no more, as in the days of old, in the times of the patriarchs, would a man simply build an altar to sacrifice for his children and his wife and his descendants before the Lord as the priest of the family. Now he would come to the sons of Aaron, and he would come to the tabernacle courtyard, and his sacrifice would be given on the one altar, just as Jesus is the one sacrifice for sin. The woman at the well outside of Sychar said to Jesus, "You say in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship, but our fathers worshipped on this mountain, the high places." And Jesus said to her, "You don't even know what you worship. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews." And Jesus is that salvation that is of the Jews. The purpose of one altar in Jerusalem was to point to the one sacrifice for sin. In chapter 18, the people are commanded to be separated from the immorality of the idol worshippers around them. Not just the immorality of idol worship, but the immorality of the idol worshippers. They would have sex with family members. They would go to the temples of the pagan gods and goddesses, and they would have sexual fertility rites and call it worship. They would give their children as sacrifices to their gods. They were not good people. Debauchery was celebrated in their pagan festivals. And so the people of Israel were told, "You will be separated from the immorality of the peoples round about you." Um, the chapter 18 goes on to talk about how, verse 26, "Ye shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not commit any of these abominations, neither any of your own nation, nor any stranger that sojourneth among you. For all these abominations have the men of the land done, which were before you, and the land is defiled. That the land spew not you out also when ye defile it, as it spewed out the nations that were before you." So, in other words, God is saying, all of these things that I'm telling you not to do are the reason that I'm kicking these people out of the land. So, don't be the next group to be kicked out of the land. And that brings us to chapter 19. The people are to separate from idolatry. They came out of Egypt, where there was rampant idolatry. And among the gods of the Egyptians were the gods of the bulls. And among the gods of the Canaanites were the gods of the bulls. And there in the wilderness, when Moses went up into the mountain and they didn't know what had become of him, Aaron made them gods in the shape of golden calves. They were being told to separate from the idolatry of Egypt and not to participate in the idolatry of the Canaanites. Don't worship other gods. Don't bow down to them. Don't follow in their ways, because this will corrupt the people of God. Um, a lot of times, I think this is sometimes underestimated in its applicative properties. We think naturally about, as Baptists, we should be careful not to be mixed up with heretics like Methodists and Pentecostals and Calvinists. But I don't think that we really stop and think about the fact that he's not talking about Christians with a few doctrinal errors here. He's talking about people who worship other gods, right? He's not talking about heretics. He's talking about pagans. Um, and I think we need to be careful that we are separated from the idolatry of our world, right? There's there's idolatry in the world today. Um, all of you are in our apologetics class. Isn't it easy to just kind of be casually aware of how much idolatry is in the world, but not really think about it too much until you're in a situation like you're in apologetics class and you're almost forced to confront it? I think we allow the materialism, humanism, naturalism, and postmodernism of atheism to invade our philosophy and theology far more than we realize. We live in a supernatural world, but oftentimes we want to be seen as intellectual and enlightened, so we downplay the supernatural parts of the Bible. I think we should be careful about not allowing the worldviews of the fallen to infect us. All right, we're going to have to speed up. We've got like 10 minutes to go. Um, in chapter 20, capital crimes are spelled out, and for these things one shall die. It's interesting that the first one is blasphemy. It's not murder, it's blasphemy. Whether a stranger in the land or a child of Israel blasphemes the name of God, curses the name of God, they must die. Okay? Murder is also listed among the sins that require capital punishment. In chapter 21, I'm sorry, somebody start speaking? True that. Yeah. Um, chapter 21 is about the sanctity of the consecrated. And it starts with the sanctity of God's priests in the first half, and in the latter half, the sanctity of God's offerings. The things that are dedicated, consecrated to God are His, and that must be respected. And then part 5 is about practicing the presence of Jehovah in the land. And we begin with the Sabbaths and feasts of Israel. First, the weekly Sabbath, which portrays Jesus in creation. He is the rest of God. Secondly, the Passover, which portrays Jesus at Calvary. Then the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which portrays Jesus in his body, the churches. And then the Feast of First Fruits, which portrays Jesus's resurrection. And then comes the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost, which portrays the coming of the Spirit after the ascension of the Christ. And then the Feast of Trumpets and the return of the Christ. And then the Day of Atonement, which portrays the coming tribulation when there will be a reckoning for the sins of man. And finally, the Feast of Tabernacles, which portrays the millennial kingdom of Christ when God will dwell among men for 1,000 years. I said we had to hurry, but I'm going to pause for a moment to see if you have any questions or thoughts on those 8 pictures of Jesus. So, the Day of Atonement and the Feast of Weeks and the Feast of Tabernacle. A lot of people get confused about Passover. Passover was a meal they were supposed to eat at home. Okay. Uh-huh. Yep. The Feast of Tabernacles. All right. And then part B. Yeah, they're very close to each other in time. Yes. Yep. They're both in the fall. Um, all right, so chapters 24 and 25, the holy law of the holy people in the Holy Land. He begins by describing the oil and the showbread for the lampstand and the table in the sanctuary. He goes on to talk about blasphemy and shows us an example of it being a capital crime. Laws of equity and justice are introduced in chapter 24. The sabbatic year of rest for the land in chapter 25, 1 through 7, the year of Jubilee in which the sold persons and sold property must be returned to the families it was given to by God, the law of redemption of inheritance, the treatment of a poor brother, and the kinsman redeemer, illustrated in the book of Ruth, foreshadowing the work of Christ as the kinsman redeemer of Adam and Adam's children, able to make the restitution, able to pay the price of redemption, willing to pay the price of redemption, and near of kin. Those are the qualifications of the kinsman redeemer. In chapter 26, I think this is somewhat prophetic. You might spend some time looking at this week. Blessings, chastening, cursing, all of these are conditional. You can choose to be blessed, you can choose to be chastened, you can choose to be cursed, you can choose life or you can choose death. The conditions of blessing in the land, which can be summarized in one word, obedience, are explained in Leviticus 26, 1 through 13. Okay? Um, the conditions of chastening are in 26, 14 through 15. And I think these are prophetic. I think if you look at the history of Israel, you will find that 7 things that are about to be described are going to happen in succession over the course of the history of Israel. The first chastening in verses 16 and 17, because the people are not faithful to God, but go chasing after other gods. The first chastening comes, and if you look at what it says, it will come in terror, consumption, and burning ague that shall consume the eyes and cause sorrow of heart, and ye shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it. This happened in the time of the judges. Okay? And in verse 18, if you will not yet for all this hearken unto me, then will I punish you 7 more times for your sins. And this also happened during the time of the judges. Okay? Um, and you begin to see, if you follow this pattern throughout, that he eventually comes after 5 periods of chastening in Israel to the place where the captivity and the diaspora, the dispersion, are prophesied in verses 32 through 39. But there is the promise that God's promises to Abraham will be kept. The covenant might be broken on Israel's part, but God never breaks his promises, and Israel will be restored. Interesting. And that leads us into the final chapter, chapter 27, dedications and vows to God. The law of dedicated persons is in verses 1 through 8. The law of dedicated beasts or sacrificial animals in verses 9 through 13. The law of a dedicated house in verses 14 and 15. And the law of dedicated land in 16 through 25. If you wanted to redeem or buy back something that was dedicated to God, it is spelled out how you go about that. And then he says there are three things that always, always, always belong to Jehovah: the firstling of beast, the firstborn of beast, anything that has been dedicated, see above, and the tithe or the first tenth of the land, the tree, and the beast. Questions, comments, heads ready to explode. Yeah, to really do a good Old Testament survey, just an overview of the books of the Bible, I think I would actually need a 3 hour a week course every semester for 4 years that you're in Bible college to really do the Old Testament. And that's just an overview. Um, so I'm sorry for going so fast, but time being what it is. All right. Well, no, I think what it does is it would have continued the patriarchal priesthood concept. The leader of the clan, the patriarch, is the priest. Just as Job or Abraham or Isaac or Jacob making sacrifices for their children. Um, right, right. So lesson 18 coming up next is the book of Numbers, which is the tale of the Israelites' wanderings in the wilderness. So we're going to, after in uh, Exodus and Leviticus, covering a few weeks to a few months, we're going to go to covering 39 plus years in the wilderness, leading from Kadesh Barnea back to Kadesh Barnea in a great circle. So uh, we'll also see if we can at least get a good start on Deuteronomy so we can try to get back on track to finish the semester on pace. So see you guys tomorrow, and thank you for your attention.